The world is being primed to regard China as a new enemy. The great power game is called perpetual war.
Our first president, George Washington, said, if you want peace, prepare for war.
Where are we going to stop this process before it starts a war?
The aim of this film is to break a silence, and nuclear war is no longer unthinkable. The equivalent of one Hiroshima bomb was exploded in these islands every day for 12 years.
They're not trying to run the world. They want to keep America from dominating.
We need an enemy for all this money, and China's the perfect enemy.
United States scientists conducted human radiation experiments to study how human beings absorb radiation.
There's really nothing more terrifying than this.
The Chinese, 2,000 years ago, built the Great Wall to keep the barbarians out, not to invade them.
As we look at China on the map, we can see that China is the basic cause of all of our troubles in Asia.
China, they want to dominate a huge chunk of the planet.
It is time to show the whole world that America is back.
I pity a country that would come up against us. We get better and better and better.
All right, well, joining us on the line today is an award-winning journalist and documentary filmmaker with more than 50 titles to his credit. In fact, maybe 60 now with this latest film. His name is John Pilger. His latest film is entitled The Coming War on China. John, thank you so much for joining us on Follow the Money Radio.
You're very welcome.
I want to move to this topic of the plight of the Marshall Islanders in the post-World War II era as they became, in essence, guinea pigs for the effects of American radiation testing. I was not aware of this history. In fact, I would venture to say that most Americans do not know much of the history about America, of course, but especially this. Can you fill us in a little bit more about this for those who haven't seen the film?
Well, the film opens in the Marshall Islands. The Marshall Islands is where, following the bombing, the atomic bombing of Japan, it's where the nuclear age really began. Between 1946 and 1958, the United States exploded the equivalent of one Hiroshima bomb in the Marshall Islands. So everything from its early atomic bombs to its later hydrogen bombs were tested in the Marshall Islands. The Marshall Islands were a trust territory of the United States. The United Nations had passed in trust the welfare of the Marshall Islanders to the United States, and instead the US really devastated the environment, both the natural environment and the human environment. Most, I think, of your readers will have heard of Bikini, perhaps mainly because it's named after the bikini swimsuit, but the bikini swimsuit was actually named after the explosions that devastated that island of Bikini in the Marshall Islands. So it's there that the whole nuclear menace really got underway. And right in the middle of the Marshall Islands, the biggest island, Kwajalein, is the Ronald Reagan missile test site. And that was set up in the 1960s with China as, in effect, its target. And that it's one of the US's most secretive bases. So the connection with the current atmosphere between the US and China, the provocations, is really centered on that particular base in the Marshall Islands, surrounded by this history. You know, there was a secret program called 4.1, which began as a program to examine mice, the effects of high-yield nuclear weapons on mice. And this became a program to examine the effects of high-yield nuclear weapons on human beings. So the Marshall Islands really are a dark history that are very much related to events today.
Yeah, and a history again that many Americans are probably not aware of, but they'll learn as they watch the film. It provides a really striking background and a backdrop to the facts that you lay out. And I want to get to some of those facts now. That one of the things that I found very staggering from the film was the pivot to Asia that took place back in 2011, that began in 2011 underneath then President Obama. Has now led, as you very cleverly show in the documentary, about 400 military bases now that surround China. And it's very difficult to imagine a country not feeling threatened by that. And you really draw that out in the film. So it really forces the Westerner, as they're watching the film, to think outside of their own skin, to think outside of their own country, their own nationality, and to realize that this military-industrial complex that has been built is now basically noosing up the second largest superpower in the world on our watch. And it's difficult, I think, for many Americans to imagine a hot war, a hot full-scale war with China. But that is the thesis of your film. Talk about this coming war with China that you envision. Does the Trump administration aggravate this from your perspective? Does he make things better? What's your take on that?
Well, the theme of a willful ignorance on the part of the United States and American people, but particularly American elites, has been the theme of most of my films, actually. And it is the major issue today that, I mean, several times in your questions, you've said, well, we don't really know about this. And I think the question that your readers, your listeners might like to ask themselves is why they don't know. Because the pivot to Asia announced by President Obama in 2011 was not a secret, but as you say, very few people know about it. It meant the transfer of most U.S. naval and air forces to the Pacific, Asia-Pacific region by the year 2020. And the object of that was to confront China. Well, that's a pretty important thing to know about. And in the land which has constitutionally the freest press, freest media in the world, the depth of this almost amnesia, this denial, this willful ignorance is quite extraordinary, to the point where Trump arrives, and you've just mentioned him, so I'll try and answer your question. Trump arrives, a kind of cartoon version of everything that's gone before, but not all that different. The kind of devastation in Syria that we're seeing and in Yemen being carried on by the Obama administration, and before that, the Bush administration, and before that, in various forms, parts of the world, the Clinton administration, and so on. There's a continuity. Trump is slightly unpredictable, but there isn't a great deal of difference between him and those that have gone before. And I think it is a question. It is probably the most urgent question that people ask themselves, why don't we know about this? Why don't we debate this? We're doing this on this program at the moment, and that's all well and good. But as you rightly said, ask people about the Marshall Islands, a place absolutely devastated by the US, and they won't know. Ask them about Bikini, they'll say the swimsuit. That's the question, why?
As we look at North Korea, and that, especially as you look at North Korea, do you see that as the epicenter of this coming conflict with China? I know the South China Sea, we could talk about that as well, but North Korea seems to be a proxy, or at least they appear to be a proxy for China, a good bargaining chip for China as they attempt to maneuver and deal with the United States. North Korea, how concerned should the West be about North Korea? Is it a red herring? Is it a real problem? How do you look at it?
Jerry, the world should be concerned about the United States, not North Korea. Understanding the history of that part of the world, you would understand the utter devastation of Korea in the so-called Korean War in the 1950s. The whole issue of North Korea and this strange but rather predictable regime in North Korea, the whole issue can be explained by the need for a peace treaty for a war that ended in 1953. And the United States refuses to sit down and negotiate a peace treaty with North Korea. Instead, we have a barrage of caricatures of this regime, many of them absolutely correct. It's a very strange regime and not a particularly pleasant one. But to end this danger, it means negotiating with North Korea. North Korea keeps popping up its missiles to say, well, look at us. We're still here and we still want a peace treaty. They've made it very clear. But if you had a peace treaty, of course, there'd be no reason to have 50,000 US soldiers in Korea. That's the reason for the present problems in North Korea. North Korea isn't a proxy at all, a proxy for China. In fact, China has tried to persuade the North Korean regime to tone down its provocations, and sometimes successfully, often unsuccessfully. But Trump appears to be beating his chest over North Korea, and if he does attack North Korea, I think people have to understand what he's really doing. He's attacking Asia, because everything is close together there, Japan, China, to attack the peninsula of Korea, and North Korea, whose capital, Pyongyang, is a few hours' drive from the capital of South Korea, Seoul. There would be devastation. That's probably the most dangerous situation at the moment, and in my view, can only be deterred by people speaking about what the issues really are on the Korean peninsula. It's been going on too long. There could be stability there. There may not be the regime that people want, but there won't be the prospect of war and nuclear war, and that's what we've got at the moment.
I wonder if you think that this war is inevitable. Is it inevitable given the trajectory of the United States, given what we know about the history of the West? Is it an inevitable war? What can be done to change this potential future that you envision?
No, I don't think it is inevitable. I don't think anything is inevitable. I don't believe in that. But there is certainly a real possibility. And, you know, what could happen and what often happens with the beginning of major wars is they begin by mistake or by accident. But first, if you create this atmosphere of provocation, of a sort of a rhetorical standoff between states, it's fertile ground for a war. A form of that happened a century ago in Europe at the beginning of the First World War. That's the real risk here. I like to believe that even the most deranged general in the Pentagon doesn't want to blow us all up with nuclear weapons. I may be wrong, I don't know, but I don't think so. I don't think the United States wants a nuclear war, because the United States, as I think I've illustrated very clearly in my film, would itself be devastated in a nuclear exchange with a power like China. But it's this provocation, it's this risk-taking, this shouting. You know, what has happened in the last 20, 25 years is that what used to be called diplomacy has almost been extinguished. That great powers, especially the United States, speaks in terms of the saber. The sabers are rattled. You know, that's such a primitive way of dealing with other states. So there's been a regression. We've almost lost that rather strange practice called diplomacy. But diplomacy often got us out of situations, when I say us, I mean humanity, in which we might have had a war. What can be done about it? What can be done about it is that people start speaking up. and identifying what the real problems are. You know, right through the US election campaign, there was what we're talking about now wasn't even an issue. There was nothing. Now there's this absurd obsession with a complete nonsense that Russia intervened in the US election, of which there is not the slightest evidence, when in fact the issue should be the very thing that we're discussing. How do you stop a war happening between nuclear armed states?
And you had brought up the generals at the Pentagon, hopefully not wanting war, but it is something that is worthy of note that our generation may not even really understand the horror of war, sadly. We certainly have not had to sacrifice for wars in recent times, so it's almost as if our generation is detached from the horrors of war. We see war as kind of a inflationary event that might help the stock market. We don't see it for what it truly is, and that's a really sad thing.
I think that's a very good point. It's a very good historical point. It's interesting, if you look at the reaction in St. Petersburg, the bombing of the underground there, I've read some very interesting commentary on that and how people went about their business, that the authorities immediately made all public transport and taxis free so that they could go on searching for other bombs, and in fact they found another one. Now, the same, let's say, stoicism or coolness happened in London during the IRA campaign in the 1970s, when you got into an underground train and you didn't really know if you were going to be a victim of an attack. Those two countries, in my view, have known war on their own soil. The United States hasn't. You describe it very colorfully there, but the Second World War was actually quite a lucrative operation for the US, not for all those soldiers who died, of course, but even the numbers of soldiers dying, were few compared with, say, the 27 million who died in the Nazi invasion of Russia. So that long memory, it's not all that long, in Europe and in Russia and in China. China devastated for most of the 19th century and most of the 20th century, actually, certainly up to the mid-20th century. That memory of war and of chaos and of dispossession is very, very vivid. It's not so in the United States, unless you've got a memory that goes back to the Civil War, and I doubt whether anyone does. But it's not there. And I think that's a factor. I think it's also a factor that history is not taught in schools. The whole sense of the past and how it affects the present and the future is not taught. You know, technology is now so consuming us that the very basics, like understanding our past and learning from the lessons of our past, just isn't there. That's one of the problems.
Fascinating discussion with our guest today, John Pilger. He is an award-winning journalist and a documentary filmmaker. We're in our final moments here with him. He has 60 different titles to his credit. The 60th title is The Coming War on China. John, I would like for you to share with our audience how those who have listened to this broadcast, who would like to get a copy of this film, to either view it for themselves or share it with their friends and family, how can they get a hold of this film?
Well, the U.S. distributor is Bullfrog Films, Bullfrog, Bullfrog Films. It's in Pennsylvania. And there is an email address, john@bullfrogfilms.com. I think an email to that address, or just look at the Bullfrog Films website. They're the distributor of The Coming War on China. They do a very good job, and I do hope your listeners are able to draw something from this work because it affects them.
We certainly encourage them to check it out. I saw the film, and I certainly vouch for the for the research you put into it. I know you've been doing this for a long time. You've been speaking out about these kinds of topics for a long time, and this is a particularly compelling film, I think, for this hour. Thank you so much for joining us, John. I really appreciate your time today.
Thank you very much, Jerry.